Thanks, Brian. So, yeah, we have a great mix today of leaders from industry organizations and vendors in the CIAM space. I think it'll be very interesting to get experience from what's going on from both perspectives. So with that, I'd like to welcome our panelists, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves one at a time. And ladies first. So let's start with Janet.
Hi, Kris. Hi, everybody. Good evening. This is Janet Ling from Loblaw. I'm responsible for consumer-facing technology. Very happy to be here to share any learnings, any industry insights with all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet. Tony, over to you.
Yeah, good afternoon. So my name is Tony Lauro. I'm the Director of Security Strategy for Akamai. I work in Akamai's Advanced Technology Group. And basically what we do there is, as we're developing new technology to meet our customers' needs, I work with the customer and I work with Akamai development and research to make sure that we're, going to meet the needs that we need to, and that we're innovating in any way possible. So thanks for having me, and I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, Tony. And just folks, this is in no particular order. Nathaniel.
Nathaniel Coughlan, Chief Security Officer, Cloudentity. Been focused on the CIAM market space for the last decade. Really looking at how you can start to onboard customer APIs and partner APIs into your identity ecosystem as quickly as possible by externalizing and normalizing OIDC and OAuth.
That's great. Thanks, Nathaniel. Brian?
Hi, it's Brian Moore. I'm an infrastructure and identity architect for the Standard, or financial services company in Portland, Oregon. And we've been through a significant CIAM uplift and journey over the past 3+ years.
That's great. And finally, Ernani, last but not least.
Hi, everyone. Ernani here. I lead the architecture practice at Questrade. I am one of my professional passions is API strategy in general, and then with that also open banking. I would say even open data in general. And yeah, happy to join the discussion and emit some opinions.
Yeah, you bet. So why is CIAM more critical now than ever? Just a few stats we pulled for this talk here. That Walmart online sales soared 74% in Q1 of 2020. Loblaw saw a rush to retail, and customer count and basket size quadrupled, while e-commerce traffic tripled in Q1 2020. A lot of this is COVID related. Adidas online sales were up by 34% in Q1. Frito-Lay chip company launched an e-commerce store in 30 days. And according to the financial brand site, people who stayed away from bank branches and learned to bank digitally won't be coming back into a branch soon, or possibly ever. So consumers have shifted to bank exclusive online as they do not feel safe going into the branch. Janet, so from a general CIAM perspective, given the physical distancing mandate of COVID-19, how has CIAM become more significant to sectors such as retail and financial services?
Yeah, so it's very obvious and very straightforward as the whole pandemic accelerate the whole digital transformation, right? CIAM as a foundational capability for any type of online platform, e-commerce or banking or any other online transaction that requires logging becomes much more important as a result of the physical distance or pandemic. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Like the result, right? The volume has increased in some business like 3 times, 4 times, 5 times.
It's a huge explosion.
It's exciting, but it's like for Loblaw, we're lucky that we have significantly invested in the last few years with internal teams and external partners, that we have this technology in place, that we're ready when this pandemic happens, that with all the huge traffic coming through our system, that we have the sustainable, scalable, secure technology in place.
And Brian, same question to you. So how is COVID?
Yeah, COVID's has not had as profound an effect, at least on our immediate business, because we largely sell life insurance, disability insurance, and retirement plans to large employers. So it's not really a retail transaction typically. So the physical distancing aspect of it hasn't really had as big an impact on us. I would say that it has impacted our customer service, call volumes around claim submission. We have a online app that's Personal Savings Center. It's a 401k management app that our customers use. Whenever there's market volatility or stability, people are always logging in more frequently to check the state of affairs. So it's had those kinds of bumps, but I think what it does do is it sort of underlines the importance, it kind of goes what Janet said, of the digital initiatives that we already, in our case, already kind of have in place, ongoing. They're somewhat, they're moving into the future, but the criticality of being able to quickly adapt to changes in customer behavior, and potentially interactions between us as an entity and other third parties is it's becoming pretty apparent that we have to be on a digital identity footing to be able to survive these kinds of disruptive forces.
Yeah, and I've certainly heard that theme many times, is that those organizations that had invested in identity, invested in CIAM pre-COVID are the ones certainly who are reaping the benefits of that with everything that's been going on. Ernani?
Okay, I would say at least if I, speaking for Questrade here, mostly the effects of COVID, at least on that side of the business, like we are retail too, right? But we've been online retail since forever. So there wasn't we didn't require like a change of posture, at least in our systems or how we handle IAM. It was actually mostly positive, the effect of COVID, because everyone wanted to trade, right? So retail brokerage is the main line of business there. And we already had an online posture mostly everywhere. We only had to take care of like really one physical location, which is kind of we can't call it really a branch, but it's a location where we receive mail and we have some in-person customer service there. But we were able to move pretty much 95% of our staff to work remotely, like within weeks of the isolation starting. So I don't know, in this case, like in our situation, because we were already online, we already had a CIAM well implemented, our customers mostly didn't see much impact, and we were able to keep servicing everyone well. But in general, very high volumes.
Yeah.
The other thing I would call out is, in additional to address the digital traffic that's driven by COVID, right? Having CIAM as a foundational capability is also a foundational enabler for companies to roll out quickly roll out digital new products, right? So that's a very foundational capability. Without that, it becomes very extremely manual, difficult to roll out to launch digital innovative product in weeks. You're thinking about months, years.
Yeah. So it's, again, a foundational element that you build upon, right? And I know that you've spoken about that in the past, with all the work that you've done at Loblaws in terms of rolling out that capability. Can you share some CIAM innovations, Janet, that are going on in your organization today?
Yeah, so absolutely. There's two flavors of innovation. One is how we use CIAM to innovate the business, right? The second flavor is how we innovate CIAM as a security tool or a foundational technology platform, right? And if you look what's in the market, you guys are the experts. Passwordless, right? Web auth, biometric, and decentralized CIAM, right? So those are the trends that's happening globally, right? How we go ahead of what's happening on the dark side and be innovative in a way to protect our customers. And when we continue to do test on those technology capabilities, you want to also test how the customer's reaction, right? Then you have that closed loop from the customer. Do they like the way that you tweak the CIAM from a technical capability perspective? What is the customer's reaction? Are we increase the conversion rate of the registration? Is the customer walking away by the technology that you tweaking? So it's an ongoing evolvement of CIAM platform and capabilities. And as a result, you will get the stickiness from your customer. They become loyal, and you will continue to increase your security posture within your platform and products.
And so, question for sticking a little bit outside the vendors here for another moment or so, but for Janet, Brian, and Ernani, what are some of the innovations that you're looking for from technology providers?
If I can make a comment first, I would say flexibility, right? Like I'm having a modern CIAM, right, that allows, for example, all the three pillars that you were presenting on our slides, for example, application integration or SSO into multiple applications. Having a modern one enables the business to leverage platforms where high velocity can be achieved, right? So, for example, in our case, a modern IAM allows us to obtain stateless JWT tokens, which we can use to secure edge APIs. Therefore, we can build microservices on the cloud that are protected by those APIs. And there is a tracking that customer consent was provided, the proper encryption is used on the token. We can use even stateless token, right? It is safe to do so because open standards, the correct standards are being used in there. And on that environment, which is one of the things that we are trying to strive for, there is this expansion of the cloud footprint. We ensure a good portion of the security coverage of what we're deploying in that environment is assured by the CIAM being an appropriate, a modern one that can control such tokens and such standards and the tracking of the customer consent.
Oh, that's great. Brian, anything to add on that one, or Janet?
I would say, I think one of the key innovations we're probably looking to get is into more risk-based authorization, or continuing towards continual risk-based authorization. The idea of being able to, based on the type of transaction a customer is trying to perform, being able to do various kinds of step up and higher level of assurance that users are who they say they are. That's one thing to look at an account statement. It's quite another thing to cash in your 401k and send it to a bank routing number.
Okay, and Janet, anything to add on that one in terms of stuff you're looking for, technology providers, innovations that you're looking for to line up with customer expectations?
From a vendor perspective, when I think about innovation, it's absolutely vendor agnostic, right? Whatever we follow what the customer needs, what is the market trends. So how can we help the customer in most friendly way, or like make their life easy, right? And protect them properly. That's where we are going.
Okay, thanks, Janet. So we're moving on now to open banking a little bit more. Nathaniel, for those who are new to open banking, I know I tried to cover it a little bit, but maybe you could share with us your take on what it is and why it's important.
Well, so Kris, I think you got it bang on in your slides, right? Meaning it is literally the financial services joining that API economy. And it has, the effects as you shared, which ranging from being able to manage consent for the data as you're collecting it, being able to manage the consent for the data as a corporation sharing it, and then of course building a very robust user integration / user experience around how you're collecting that data and when you're collecting it and how you're applying that collection of the data. Now, the really interesting thing about open banking, as well as the emerging privacy laws, are the change in how we view authorization, right? Particularly as you move into distributed services, functions, etc. It's no longer what can a user do in an application, right? The kind of more traditional RBAC, ABAC models, but it really starts to become what can a service know about a user even before I bring the user context to that service to determine what actions I can take in the service. And so that's one of the things that we see a lot of companies struggling with as they seek to determine, what does it look like from a continuous contextual authorization perspective of what can a service see about a user, and then also what can a user perform within that service.
Fantastic. And Ernani or Tony, did you guys want to jump in on this one at all? If not, we can move on.
Yeah, it's just, I would just complement the definition with, so it is, yeah, that fintech, the financial services adopting the API economy, but I would say a way that I like to also use to define it is it is about defining clearly where the ownership of data sits. Like, I think that is a very interesting aspect of why the open banking discussion actually exists, right? That assumption, well, today without it, right, that the data doesn't belong to you as a customer, it belongs to the institution that holds your data, right? So if your data is at the bank, it's the bank's data. I think the concept of open banking shifts that. It flips, it says, no, the data belongs to the customer. My relationship with the bank is a service relationship in which the bank is taking care of my data. That's the service I pay for. But the data is mine. And if I have a framework in which I can instruct the bank in certain specific scenarios, I want that data shared for my benefit, I would like to do so. I think that to me defines open banking maybe a little bit less technical way and more value-driven way, right? Like, this is why I think we need to talk about it.
Yeah, sounds good. Ernani, what do you think are some of the benefits for customers when it comes to open banking?
Okay, I did jump the gun then because I kind of like the example I gave was exactly the one I was thinking, right? But just being practical, imagine if I have a relationship with bank A for many years, right? So that bank knows me really well, but I'm switching to a new phone provider, right? And maybe that phone provider requires me to prove my income so I can go on a higher plan, right? I know that in most case scenarios today, what they're going to do is they're just going to go to Equifax, check my credit register and whatever. But a much simpler way would be if I could share from my bank profile with that provider what my basic profile is, meaning not just the identity aspect of it, but my attributes, right? My name is Ernani, Cecon, and my annual income derived from what the bank sees from me is X. And I say, okay, I authorize you to release that information. My email address, my home address, my first and last name, and my verified income for that provider so I can open that account. Much simpler, right? It's my data. I authorize the bank to do that. I think this is an example of a benefit. I know it's a small one, but if you go to a higher aspect on what changes in society, if you have that kind of stuff, is if you have proper CIAM, and every bank, I would say, has one, you can ensure that your data is secure there. And you can establish proper data sharing mechanisms rather than letting the market control that. And then things like, for example, screen scrapers start showing up. And incredibly, although Canada, a very traditional country, most people are very scared of sharing data, the adoption is actually pretty high. A lot of people are using screen scrapers today. And to use them, you have to give them your bank password. I would say that's probably a lot higher value than any of the data your bank has, because you pretty much gave them everything now, right? By giving them your password. Open banking, and I like it, the concept you said, let's change the name because it's a scary name, but the framework gives you a much better protected way of you enabling that kind of service, right? And if people are starting to do that and give them the password, it's because they see the value. There is a technology value there. Then let's do it properly.
Gotcha.
I would say that a lot of the open banking benefits are going towards the customers, right?
Sorry, could you just repeat that, Janet?
Yeah, like most of the open banking benefits goes towards our customers, right? For example, increase the transparency from the bank to the customer, from the financial institution to our customers, or increase the competitiveness between all the financial institutions, right? So with open banking, that the customer is able to access their information across different banks via the same platform or system. Therefore, it increased the challenge between the financial institutions. It all goes towards the end customer.
Yeah.
Yeah, Kris, I wanted to add a couple things. I think that there's a lot of great points that have been made, and I do think the beauty of open banking is really going to benefit the customer. And you look at the potential of what data sets can be shared, what information can be shared profile wise, and how that can be integrated. One of the things that I've been talking a lot about with customers is essentially, Nathaniel's going deep into the conversation of the API integrations between banks and third parties. We see this in retail as well, kind of the same model where there are major benefits to the consumer if you can do a little bit of integration between what you know about the consumer identity, right? Tracking that across an omni-channel experience to provide the best possible, solution sets or digital assets to that user as they travel across those different environments. But the integration of this is generally through a technology, which API in and of itself is not insecure, but the enablement of API technology is seen as machine-to-machine communication, and as long as you set it up right in the first place, it should be okay. We see a massive amount of application exploitation coming against these API endpoints, particularly as attackers look at the business logic of how an application functions. They'll look at that API call, and you can obviously intercept your own traffic, so you can see what that call looks like and then manipulate it just a bit, and then all of a sudden, because the API endpoint on the consumer side doesn't see, it doesn't know to expect anything else, invalid data is returned to the attacker. So we see this in logon, we see this in purchasing and checkout for retail corporations, inventory sniping. All these tools are written around the API interfaces for these websites. So API security becomes a huge factor, as well as obviously the integration of the CIAM and the identity, saying, listen, if I can validate all of these different factors, I know the risk is extremely low because of these, different assessments I've made. Let me streamline that good user and give them the best possible experience, while I start to say, okay, there's a secondary model here I'm going to have to apply to the potentially bad traffic. And what does that look like? So that's been, I think, a big challenge for a lot of organizations as they integrate security and CIAM across retail and open banking.
Yeah, absolutely. And just while we have you, Tony, since Akamai's purchase of JanRain, can you tell people about what's been going on with the product, and anything you could share in terms of future direction as well?
Yeah, this was really a big piece of the puzzle missing for Akamai's portfolio. In the beginning, we were looking at validating requests as they come into a customer environment, whether it be a bank or an e-commerce site. And we started to say, as we're looking at how bad guys and gals launch attacks, the automated process has just gotten so good that they can very closely mimic a real user engagement with the website. Especially as you kind of even as you look at taking biometric feedback, maybe from a mobile device, you're taking accelerometer data. We've seen attackers replay accelerometer data, replay their own valid logon and add a little bit of noise so that it looks different in case you're watching for replay attacks, things like that. So as we look at kind of the integration of identifying good users, the clear indicator to us became, okay, just like we've done, a checkout waiting room for users that we don't know a lot about during a ticket sale, for instance. And then the good users who already had a previous cookie, already have account profile being passed along with their session, they get the priority access. So giving that same kind of priority access to a CIAM identified customer, it can totally change the game in terms of how users interact with a brand, especially when you look at tracking that across, again, like I mentioned, these omni-channel experiences across different brands and different technologies, streamlining those good users while kind of taking the traditional things we were doing before of bot mitigation, credential stuffing protection, and logon abuse protection, integrating that security story into the big picture of all of that. So there's a lot of great stuff coming down the pipe. A lot of it has to do, again, with what are all the things that we can know about a user that are very hard for an attacker to identify. A username and password could be breached from another website, and then an attacker comes across and uses a username and password, reuses it on your site, and if it works, great, you got to match the users in, or the attackers in for that matter. But if you start to look at layering CIAM into the first step of this process, we're saying now we know many things about the user that the attacker probably would never know, like maybe what type of device you're coming from, maybe that you're coming from AT&T ISP in Dallas, Texas, for instance, right? Those are things that are very hard for the attacker to come up with. So integrating the capabilities from bot detection and login detection, as well as API inspection, having that as another layer on top of what Janrain was doing is kind of the way forward. That's what we're doing, and I think that's going to be the most beneficial for all of our customers.
Gotcha.
I'd just chime on to what Tony said there around a couple of things. One is the really the importance, the foundational importance, I think, of identity proofing, really as that base for level of assurance and confidence that you're actually enrolling and collecting the data for the right person that's legitimate. I think that's something that some organizations miss as a first key step. And then I think the other part of which kind of reflects on talking about streamlining customer experience, and this is from my own journey, is you really can't overemphasize the importance of minimizing the user friction, of really understanding that customer journey and that UX, particularly when you go through something like a first time data collection process, like an MFA enrollment. I mean, that can be pretty, not handled well, that can be pretty abrasive experience, but it's really important to make that go as smoothly as possible, obviously because of the, of the net benefits that, both you and the customer are going to, be able to collect. But if you get that, if you get that UX experience wrong, or that customer journey and interaction experience wrong, or don't properly prepare yourself on your customer service organization to support those changes, you lose some of the power and the importance of making those CIAM investments.
Yeah. So, Nathaniel, I just wanted to switch over to you to talk about some of the challenges that you've seen out there in terms of trying open banking and the banking industry, customer data sharing. Anything that you can talk to in terms of the projects or use cases that you've been working on with Cloudentity?
Sure. I mean, some of the biggest ones, as I mentioned, are, how are you going to control authorization? And, how we thought about authorization and identity for the last, 20 odd years is really, what role am I? Can I get to an application? It's been very, very coarse grained. So with open banking, coupled with GDPR, privacy laws, and the emerging case laws coming out of those, it's really getting down to the data object itself. And the interesting thing of that, and mapping it back to what Tony just said, is if we look at the case law and the data object level authorization, that's literally number one on the OWASP API security threat, right? Number one is broken object level authorization. Number two is broken authentication. So if we kind of take that as a bigger picture, the biggest challenges facing banks or open banking today is, how do I secure these high value transactions? And it's not just money going across the wire, it's PII, it's people's data, it's the oil, right? to quote The Economist. But when you misuse it, right, that oil becomes the CO2, meaning it's polluting the atmosphere, making things get too hot. It's running amok. So being able to control that, making sure that your data only goes where it's supposed to go, and it's not just one big access token or one big identity token that's carrying the full user context, but literally only the data objects a service is allowed to see about that user, because the user's already consented to use them. The other big thing that the open banking makes challenging is one, it's some of the newer standards in OAuth, right? So FAPI read write profile, some of the other FAPI pieces that are coming down the pipe. Second piece is mutual TLS coming from your API gateway. And so what we see over and over again is the vast majority, of the market leaders, I think is a fair way to say it, from an API gateway perspective, aren't supporting these net new OAuth flows, much less the ability to do mutual TLS termination. So you actually need to, either write plugins or do some type of work, insert an open banking security gateway almost to offload some of that work in conjunction with your API gateway for building and managing your APIs.
Yeah, and that was actually one of the slides I threw up quickly there, was in the international context, was the financial API, or the FAPI standard that was released in 2018. I know Cloudentity is certified FAPI compliant, which is an OpenID Connect standard for doing read and write of in open banking scenarios. So it basically, if I can maybe dumb it down a little bit, is to just say, take all the best practices of OpenID Connect, as well as all the best practices of OAuth security, OAuth 2, OAuth 3, and then adding on some additional protocol specifics to enhance the security of read and write operations, as well as the back channel flow that's also in the specification for initiating payments. So yeah, very interesting stuff. We've got, well, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was going to add just a tiny little bit on top of that, but it's okay. Keep going. My apologies.
That's okay. But I just wanted to take a quick look at the Q&A here. I apologize if I haven't been following it. But Janet, there's a question here that asks, what is the current Loblaw's digital release cycle for your e-commerce platform? And how has CIAM helped reduce your release cycle?
Those are two different things, right?
Yeah.
We don't do weekly release on CIAM. CIAM is pretty stable system, right? It's
for your e-commerce platform.
Right, like CIAM is, we create that as centralized service, and in order to create, provide a very secure environment for all banners, all applications. Also create a seamless. The e-commerce release cycle, it's pretty agile, right? I know that it is like we have to keep the agility to move our e-commerce environment. Whoever asked the question, we can chat offline. It's
sure.
Two different platforms.
So here's an interesting one for you as well. A lot of retailers have shifted to curbside pickup due to COVID-19, but they're managing this using pen and paper. How have you seen CIAM and technologies improve the curbside pickup experience?
Well, so this goes back to how this pandemic hugely drives the digital transformation or acceleration, right? I think we got to get rid of paper, pen in this business, right? And therefore, CIAM becomes so foundational capability for any online transaction, authentication, authorization, protects customers' information, right? So it's not on a piece of paper and somebody can throw it in the garbage and can be. So it's fast, it's convenient, it has customer experience, seamless customer experience, and also protects your information. So your credentials, your info PIs is not on a piece.
Yeah, and I think it's varied from retailer to retailer. I think we've all experienced curbside pickup, certainly with groceries, depends where you go. There's sort of a different protocol to follow when you get there, a different interaction. Maybe you call the number, maybe you use an app. There's all kinds of different things going on.
Yeah, I think it depends on each retail's readiness before this pandemic happens, right? If a retail doesn't have this centralized CIAM system in place, then you have to take some manual process just in order to tweak your business, meet the needs of the customer.
Yeah, maybe it's more of a question of e-commerce platforms supporting curbside pickup modules than it is for the CIAM system itself. Question for anyone on the panel here is, how do you see the future of self-sovereign identity, where the customer brings trusted identity attributes to requesting relying parties, as opposed to recreating their identity profile at every provider when interacting with different organizations' services? I hope I got that right. Anybody want to take that on?
Yeah, I'll jump into that one. If it's okay, somebody else wants to take it.
Yeah, thanks, Nathaniel.
So what we're seeing is that modern identity is being broken into two parts, right? I don't want to call it CIAM. I want to call it basically session and context. And that session can occur at a lot of different places, right? That session could occur at your regular IDPs, Microsoft, Google, etc. But then what gets really important is that context, being able to aggregate that context in real time for what's transpiring on the wire, right? And so we heard the gentleman from Akamai talk a little bit about bringing in more botnet type style protection. You're going to do the exact same thing with your self-sovereign identity, right? Where at the point in time when you actually need the data, you can go and actually recollect that data from the distributed identity stores that are user controlled, if and when they grant you permission consent to see those different elements of their data. And then you carry those into the transaction. Now, you'll still probably do a little bit of aggregation up front, right? Because the lag times going back and forth will be just too much unless they actually are doing, wallets with self-sovereign identifiers on your mobile device or on your client device. But there'll be some interesting, ways of both no longer having traceable PII data, meaning you'll just have a pointer out to your IDP, right? And then you'll have all of your other user consent and profiles stored relatively anonymously, so long as you can't connect them with the IDP's nonce. So we'll see we'll see organizations build big data stores like that where it's no longer PII data because it's not able to be correlated or be distinguished from other PII data, or it's randomized in real time, and then connecting that back out to self-sovereign IDs, if and when additional data sets are needed to be confirmed.
Yeah.
Sorry, a lot of words there, but
Oh, that's all good. Anyone else on that one?
It's tough to map without a picture, for me at least.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges here is ownership of identity, and obviously the brokerage of identity between two parties is one case. But if there's ever some kind of situation where you want to integrate some kind of master identity store, that obviously will come with its own share of risk as well. But I think one thing that's interesting is as you look at validating good user identities, again, I go back to the problem that I'm always talking to customers about and helping them deal with, which are creating a user account and providing irrelevant data is the absolute right of every user on the internet, right? To fake, you don't want to share your address, you put a fake address. You don't want to share this, you put fake this. So the validation of that type of data and keeping bot created accounts out of your identity source system is another huge big piece of the puzzle that I think even as you look at like Nathaniel was mentioning, the relative ways in which you can actually anonymize or decouple the PII part of the information and kind of store that separately, or you store it in a way that's not tied back to an actual user, you still are going to have the problem set, which is dealing with invalid users or users that you're treating with priority, but they don't map to any real person. So I think that's kind of a huge challenge. You don't technically see it as much in the banking space as you would in the e-commerce space, but it is an interesting problem set, especially when you look in e-commerce. You know, you create a fake email address or fake checkout profile, you know, and if you have a shoe selling, for instance, you might get priority. And in fact, a lot of the bot operating tools, they say 10 minutes before the shoe drop, go to the website and get a fresh cookie, right? And log in and validate yourself as a user. And oh yeah, because they're doing Google reCAPTCHA, log into YouTube and start watching YouTube videos in the background. That gives you a user liveliness token that when they issue a reCAPTCHA, it's a I'm not a robot checkbox instead of a complicated, find the street sign. And then you're sweating because part of the street sign's in one little square, but you're not sure if you should click that box or not. So all of those things are, these evasions and everything are really being driven by the holes in each of these processes that we're all putting together. So we have to think about, identity. Again, I'm going to beat the dead horse here, but identity and whatever technology is used to integrate and make that work with the security story, because without that, we're just going to be giving priority to users that may not even exist, because that's obviously a huge trend.
Brian, I don't know if this is a question for you, or one that you're familiar with. The insurance industry already has something called pulling an MVR, motor vehicle record / Auto Plus reports that indicate the insurance company that last serviced the client / license dates / accidents.
Well, not being in the property and casualty insurance business, I'm not familiar with that. But yeah.
Okay, and I'm not sure that the actual question is there, but I appreciate the comment. There was another one. Would the Mint app be applicable in this case? So yeah.
That's actually, speaking from real experience there, that was one of the findings when we did our migration to our MFA deployment was, to our business's surprise, the level of somewhere north of about 15 to 20% of our monthly logins were actually coming from financial service aggregators, right? And all of those, or many of them had problems at the point of our MFA transition, creating false positives, other kinds of events. We had to work with them to get them to fix their algorithms, or basically their screen scraping solutions. At the time, we did talk to, it was interesting, and kind of looked at the FAPI standards. Unfortunately, we had to really just, we had to have those aggregators sort of just fix their current solutions to work with our current MFA implementation. But I think it was a real wake-up call to the importance of this open banking and open financial systems, consumer data finance, if I think would be a good rebranding of that, because it really does talk about how you as a financial service provider really are, the customer needs to be able to make that choice, how they want to consume the data that you're holding, their data, which you're holding on their behalf. And we had quite a bit of pressure to, to solve those problems quickly. But yeah, I think the FAPI standards and the other you know, those kinds of efforts are going to drive us to develop some better B2B, really B2B experience in terms of, you know, transitive relationship between two parties that a customer provides consent to.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting to hear what comes out of the committee's second report later on this year. Hopefully it does come out, and what direction that takes in terms of the regulations that the government is going to put in place, and then how we in the industry can participate to assist with that. Ernani, we had a conversation about that the other day in terms of that committee and how that functions. Is there anything that you wanted to add about that?
I mean, sorry, just to clarify, you're talking about the standards council.
This is for the open banking, the committee that Bill Morneau started in 2018, the report that came out.
Yes. Yeah, so there is when we were talking about challenges earlier, right? Everyone was outlining technical challenges, and I thought, you know what, maybe I'll open a can of worms, but I consider the biggest challenge of all, bringing the topic of the committees, it's actually human, right? It's political in nature, which is an aspect of Canada to be able to implement open banking successfully has to be taken on by government, by a regulation entity, rather than the financial services industry directly, because you need an arm's length opinion on this whole discussion, right? Like if I, as a customer, go to Bank A and Bank A will share my data with Bank B under my authorization, like I think the regulation is kind of required to say, okay, who's accountable, right? Like they need to go and say, well, no, maybe Bank A is accountable to protect Ernani's data. And so that level of detail, not too much on the technical side on how to implement assurance or other things related to identity, right? How to make sure that an identity is not a bot, for example, which is more technical from the nature of the products we're going to use. I think it has to come from the rules, from the regulations, and that's why this is so important, and I think Canada has to move on.
Yeah,
Kris.
Yeah, Kris.
Go ahead, Janet.
Yeah, sure. I think there's another flavor to the open banking concept, right? Where it's initiated in Asia or in Europe is because of the lack of trust from the consumers to the financial institutions, right? Vices here, and Canada has the best payment system with all the regulations, OSFI, AML, KYCs in place. Like we don't have that driver in terms of lack of trust from the consumers to our financial institutions, most healthy system in the world in terms of banking payments, right? So I think to Tony's point, or to Ernani's point, that Payment Canada has looked at us. They are doing the POC of open banking, and we, like all the financial institutions, will look at Payment Canada to provide further directions. As my understanding, that it will be still a long way to get to open banking.
Tony, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I did. I think that you know, it's kind of interesting when you look at open banking and some of the initiatives that are coming up. Even in today's conversation, you kind of take a step back in the magic time machine to you know, the invention of social login integration, right? And it's login with Facebook or login with Instagram. That is becoming more and more popular as a majority of the world's consumers are on these social platforms. The technology used to integrate those kind of solutions is a very interesting one. And I think Ernani mentioned this. When you look at, login with Facebook, the first thing that's going to pop up is some kind of containerization, right? What exactly are you going to grant access between these two third parties? What are you going to exactly grant access to share? So there's that kind of the aspect of the containerization of with the open banking initiative, what things are going to be shared, and are there technical restrictions around that in terms of how that integration is done and the technical ways that that's done via API, and then to Janet's point, it is very common to have a banking customer who lives half of the year in EMEA, and then maybe the other half of the year in Canada, or whatever the case is. Where is the home base of that user, and how do regulations like GDPR and everything have to follow that user's profile for you to be able to make some kind of final delineation, of what data can be shared, between those institutions, whether the user lives in one country or another. So the technical aspect of all this, again, first of all, reminds me of social login integration, where you're making these connector relationships. But the other aspect that pops up, I think, is a compliance piece. So as these different banking third parties have the relationships to share data between each other, trying to kind of look down the road into my crystal ball and foresee kind of what kind of problems might pop up. I think it's an interesting question to kind of walk through.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. And I think we'll leave it with that as the final word. Really appreciate everyone on the panel. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights. And I hope that was valuable for people listening in on the call. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Brian.